Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. So glad you can join me and I can join you. If you're watching us on our YouTube channel, you know you can take us with you wherever you want to go, wherever you find your fine podcast content. Go and check out the Lunch Hour there. If you're listening to us on one of the many fine podcast platforms that carry us, you know you can see what's happening in studio by going and checking out our YouTube channel, and check out the other wonderful Federal Newswire programs that are out there. We've got 5, I think, podcasts in toto now. But anyway, we're spending a lot of time, and rightfully so, talking about reconciliation. We're talking about regulatory issues that are very near and dear to my heart. Joining us today is Matthew Jensen. He is the Director of Fiscal and Regulatory Analysis at AFPI. That's the America First Policy Institute's Center for American Prosperity. He's a leading expert in budgetary and economic modeling, helped shape major policies like the TCJA, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, and the pandemic's fiscal responses. As the founding director of AEI's, that's the American Enterprise Institute's open source policy center, he's driven innovations in policy simulation and open research with experience spanning government oversight, cybersecurity, and tech development. Matthew brings deep insight into the intersection of policy and economics, and we seem to have lost that thread somewhere, Matthew, over the last 50 years, the important intersection of policy and economics. We seem to want to do things without any regards to economics. That's looked at as bad. I know I just filed a petition with the OMB to get them to reopen their proceedings into how we measure costs and benefits of regulation. Did we ever have the thread and we just lost it? I mean, why are there some folks who don't want to look at the economic consequences of public policy?
Well, first, Andrew, just thank you for hosting me. And thank you to the Federal Newswire, which is a terrifically informative publication.
Thank you.
It's an honor and pleasure to be here. Yes, the country and many of its policymakers seem to have lost the thread on fiscal policy. We are now, record high levels of debt, record high levels of spending. Spending has outpaced revenues significantly because of overactive spending. And the policymaking establishment, up until, I'd say, January of this year, had no real plan to sort that out. And now the context is looking at the upcoming reconciliation package, upcoming legislative action. Otherwise, the context is that we have a new president, President Trump, who said in his inaugural address he hopes to be the most consequential president in history.
So it's interesting. I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago. Now, I went to an economic briefing around the inauguration time, and the statistic was put out to me. So we have revenues into the federal treasury of about $5 trillion annually. By the way, they tell us you never should do math on the air, so you just take this as you will.
I have my filing system right behind me.
There we go.
Let me grab it. Okay. Continue. The budget and economic outlook.
Revenues of $5 trillion, but Joe Biden's budget of $7 trillion. So clearly there's a gap of $2 trillion, which is a not inconsequential sum. And I was at a meeting last week talking about DOGE and other efforts. It came up, and I had a guy literally say to me, well, all of these cuts, it's nothing. So they're going to zero out USAID or substantially cut USAID. That's only $85 billion. That's a drop in the bucket. And I once again was reminded of the aphorism, $1 billion here and $1 billion there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money. I mean, we could talk about reconciliation, but let's talk about the $2 trillion gap first. I mean, what do we need to do in this?
Right. I mean, it's a huge gap.
Yeah.
We've got 2025 outlays. You're right on revenues, 5 trillion, outlays 7 trillion. You got a $2 trillion gap. And it's supposed to get bigger and bigger.
Right.
By the end of this budget window, it's going to be about $2.5 trillion. And you've got problems on the discretionary side. You've got problems on the mandatory side of the federal budget. And the solution to a great deal of this is, yes, cutting, but even more importantly, I think growth and deregulation.
Right.
Because if you can get this economy going again, if you can free the American people to pursue their dreams, then the American people have shown for decades now, our entire existence, 250 years, American people have shown that they are resilient, that they innovate when they're given personal liberty and personal freedom to go do that.
Right.
And so when we look at the cutting that's happening, don't just think about it, well, the 80-some billion dollars, it's more than just a drop in the bucket. It's more than just 86 drops in a bucket. It's a substantial sum, but think about it as more than that. It's actually taking away a lot of regulations, taking away a lot of rules that those agencies are putting forth. And there's going to be more of that coming. It's unleashing the American people.
Yeah, we our estimation is that for every dollar in direct regulatory costs, there's a $19 multiplier in lost opportunity cost, based on some work that was done by a couple of professors down at Appalachian State, North Carolina State, about 10, 12 years ago. So that is huge. We'll come back to the regulatory side of it in a minute. Let's talk reconciliation. Let's talk about the process. How do you view this process? What do you think is going to happen? What needs to happen?
Yeah, well, again, the context here is that we have a new president. We have a Republican Party that ran on supporting his agenda in this last election, who has said repeatedly he's seeking the greatest deregulation ever, the greatest middle-class tax cuts ever, spending cuts, massive spending cuts, unleashing prosperity through those things. And so then when we look at, President Trump has come into office, and he started to enact his agenda, that agenda. And so then when we think about what's the responsibility, what's the opportunity for the legislature here and the reconciliation process, it's to support that. It's to aid the cutting, it's to aid the deregulation, and it's to enact the greatest middle-class tax cut ever. The reconciliation process, if you support that agenda, then you can say, well, thankfully, the reconciliation process is flexible enough to accommodate it. It will allow cuts to mandatory programs. It allows cuts to taxes and changes in the tax system. And it also allows, although many people get confused on this fact, it allows for discretionary spending cuts. And the reconciliation process, if it's wielded by the legislature to advance the president's agenda, then we could see as soon as this spring, legislative changes that reinforce, that strengthen the agenda that the president's trying to put in place. I think that's the great opportunity here.
Right, because at the end of the day, I mean, you can debate back and forth what has an impact on reconciliation is all supposed to be about the budget, right? I mean, it's all supposed to. But if you're talking about dealing with the power of the bureaucracy, and that power can be measured in the number of bureaucrats. The Phoenix Center has done some work on that, the impact of each regulator on the economy, but also on the implementation of those programs and the regulations that underlie them. Right. Then you can get to things like the REINS Act or putting into statute the changes that Donald Trump implemented in 2017 and then again in 2025 on so-called regulatory dark matter. Right. If there was a piece of legislation that amended the Administrative Procedure Act to encompass so-called guidance documents and interpretations letters, that would have a huge impact on the fiscal side, but also on the regulatory cost side, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. And I think there's, for good reason, there's been a great deal of focus on regulatory costs on the right.
Yeah.
And we think about what are the economic impacts, what are the impacts across the American economy, American public, American businesses. One of the things that I think is starting to become much more apparent and much easier to act on now is that regulations also have an enormous fiscal cost.
Yeah.
They drive up prices of procurement for the federal government. They reduce the economic activity, which has a direct impact on revenues associated with that activity. Through a variety of other channels, the regulations are actually having a direct, immediate impact on the fiscal situation of the U.S. government. And then now that realization is so clear, because of this massive ramp up in regulation over the last several decades, now it's, I think, immediately obvious to the members that that regulations can be dealt with in reconciliation. Because if we target deregulatory actions, then we will have positive fiscal effects.
It is amazing to me, right? Unprecedented levels of regulation by the Biden administration in an unprecedented fashion in terms of, where they were going in terms of the implementation. I don't know what your estimations are. I know our good friends at AAF, they say 1.8 trillion. I think that's a pretty solid and direct regulatory cost. Mm-hmm. So the regulatory state grew from $2.25 trillion to just under, actually, according to them, just over $4 trillion annually. That is an astonishing figure. I mean, have you guys done any quantification over how the increase in regulatory cost, 15% per year plus under Joe Biden, unprecedented in the modern era, as I said, how that has impacted federal spending in terms of because I deal with this stuff as you and I were talking about. I don't think I've ever seen that expression. What are we talking about in terms of added fiscal burden to federal spending because of regulatory costs?
On the revenue side, it's easy to think about, because we know, approximately what percentage of GDP revenues are at, and so you can, approximately 17. If you take the 1.8 trillion number, you can hit it with your 17%. You can start to back out what do we think, several hundreds of billions of dollars. What do we think the revenue effect is? On the procurement side, it starts to get hazier, harder to, especially when you're outside government and you don't have access to these data systems that are so much in the news right now. If you don't have access to the data systems, it's harder to start to see what are the impacts on procurement. And so one of the things that I think OMB will do, and that I hope OMB does, Office of Management and Budget, over the coming months, is start to view it as part of their responsibility, not just to calculate economic impacts, but actually fiscal impacts of these regulations. And then that will, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
Well, and then that will set the groundwork, both for this reconciliation and future reconciliations. When you start to X out the regulations, you'll have this direct impact on outlays. And we already have the direct impact on revenues. We know that. And so we already know that they can show up in reconciliation. And the question is just how big the number is. And then you need to start estimating the impact on outlays in order to get that number accurately.
I mean, Matthew, we as a movement need to be better. The regulatory folks, we have to be better at getting together and coordinating. I mean, and this is not a knock on you, but what I'm saying, this is a compliment to you, because this is, I know we're all competitive. We're all competing for dollars in the grant world and all of that jazz. But in terms of being able to lend our voices to the chorus on this, you're absolutely spot on this issue of needing to now also assess the fiscal impact of this, because the two go hand in hand, obviously. And as we've been particularizing the problem, a $2 trillion gap between revenue and spending. If some of this is being driven, or a huge amount of it is being driven through the regulatory impact, the fiscal impact on regulation. I mean, that's massive. We'll come back to that in a minute.
Just one analogy, just real quick, one analogy on that point. Consider if you're doing your household spending, and there's a rule for your household. You can only buy, mauve sofas with 7 legs, and they have to be 8.5 feet long. Your spending on sofas is going to go up because you can't buy any sofa you want. You can't buy the best price sofa. You have to go buy that sofa with 7 legs.
How about this? If you have to buy health insurance, and your health insurance has to contain this and this and this and this, otherwise you're going to get hit with a penalty.
Imagine.
Is it any wonder that the cost of health insurance has skyrocketed?
Right.
And that's not even
the case.
Yeah, I mean, it really, again, this gets into this idea of we have lost any semblance of sort of economic analysis in these things. I mean, I had been telling people that healthcare costs were going to skyrocket in the wake of the Affordable Care Act because we were increasing demand for a finite good. In fact, a good whose supply was diminishing over time, and we weren't doing anything to increase the supply. Of course, healthcare costs and health insurance was going to skyrocket. This gets into it. So, I mean, where do you see it going? I mean, we've got a limited amount of time. I am very worried about the reconciliation package being as big as it is. There's no way to break it down, is there?
It's very challenging when you start breaking it down. It's not succeeded in the past. I try to have multiple big packages in one year. In the past, people have been able to do a small package, a big package, things like that. But to have multiple big packages all at once has not been successful. That said, I think the Senate and the House need to get together and figure out what the strategy is that they think will work. I hope that whatever they do, it involves either one massive bill or multiple large bills that will get at regulations, get at leasing, get at discretionary spending, not just mandatory spending, and provide tax relief. Use that money to put back in the pockets of the American people, because the American people are going to have a responsibility, or it's an opportunity, a responsibility, however you want to frame it. They have an opportunity now over the next 4 years to start to use these changes that are happening as a springboard for their own personal lives. So now is the time to go and build. Now's the time to go and have babies. I have a baby at home and it's the best thing ever. Go and do it. Now's the time to build things. Now's the time to unleash your creativity, because the government's starting to get out of the way. You have this opportunity now. And hopefully we'll see.
And we had Elon Musk, not Elon Musk. We had RFK Jr. Last week offer his support for protecting IP innovation and making sure that we're not going to attack that stupidly by going after price controls, as we've spent a lot of time talking about on this show. Let's talk about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, because obviously, that's up for renewal. We want to make things permanent. There is some question as to what the pay-fors are going to be, if there are going to be pay-fors in it. I know a lot of folks are. Let's start here. Where do you come down on the deductibility, whether or not it's personal or corporate, for state and local taxes? Where do you stand in all of this?
I've done a decent amount of research on this in the past.
Yep.
And one of the things you see with SALT deduction is that it does end up having this federal benefit going to states and localities with the very highest tax burdens. And so it overwhelmingly benefits blue states, particularly California and New York. That said, it was a tax hike. When they added it to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, it ended up increasing taxes on a great many American families. So despite not wanting to see blue states having higher taxes and it incentivizes higher taxes, despite not wanting to see federal money go to these blue states, I don't think now is the time to be thinking and worrying about tax hikes.
Here.
Because there's so much spending to cut. There's so much deregulation to make happen. There's so much to do that'll unleash the economy. Now's not the time to worry too much about who we're hiking taxes on. So I come down after I've thought about this a lot over the last decade.
Good.
I come down on I think they should restore full, as much of the SALT deduction as possible.
For me, I just come back to this. If it's not income, you shouldn't be paying. I'm not that I think, we can always look at different ways. If we're going to tax income, then tax income. But if it's not actually income to you and you've paid taxes on it, you shouldn't have to pay more taxes on it to somebody else.
Yeah, it's such a tricky issue, though.
Yeah. I mean, and I keep getting pinged on this, but let's talk about the history of the TCJA, because to me, it always comes back to, there was a really great study that the Democrat comptroller in Maryland did of the impact on Marylanders. I know that's a weird word, on Marylanders of the TCJA, and he demonstrated that 85% of taxpayers in Maryland were going to see either no change to their taxes or their taxes go down. To me, that's a stunning success. And to have a Democrat go and admit that was even better. I mean, was that right across the board? Is this part of the untold story of the TCJA? I mean, obviously, we know the leftist press doesn't want to talk about, but tell us about this.
Yeah, I mean, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, as it was passed, was a massive tax reduction for the vast majority of Americans. There was some period in the evolution of the bill where that wasn't necessarily the case. Where only a large majority, not a massive majority of Americans were seeing tax cuts in earlier iterations of the bill. But where they got in the end was that it's a large tax cut for the great many Americans. And I think one of the reasons for that, which is a big success for open source and transparency and modeling, is that during the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the development of the package, the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, all these, sort of center left, left leaning, some of them far left now, publications started to publish tools using open source models from American Enterprise Institute and others, showing what would be the household by household benefit. And then you got to the point right before the thing was passed where I thought this was beautiful. The Republicans in the House were running Twitter campaigns pointing to the New York Times calculator and saying, look, what's your tax cut? Go find your tax cut in the New York Times calculator. I think that was just such a success for open source and transparency that we were able to build these open source models. New York Times and others were able to use them and build these tools for the American public, which both showed the American public what their tax cut was and also, I think, helped the legislature encourage them to make a bigger tax cut for more people. And that bill, because of transparency, devolved to be a bigger and bigger tax cut for more and more people. And that was terrific. I think that's such a beautiful story of success. And a large part of it was because of the leadership in the House at the time. Large part of it was because of the leadership in the economic team at the White House at the time. And we ended up with a big success. And now it's time to double down, to extend it.
It's interesting because, I think we've entered an age. It's funny. I was just saying this to somebody this morning. There was a period of time when Grover Norquist, I'm not sure that Americans for Tax Reform still advocates for this. They're just not quite as vociferous as they used to be. And it's not a knock on ATR. I love ATR. But, used to be a big thing for them was to push states and localities, government at all levels, to rules that if you had a government issued credit card, then all of your those government issued credit card statements should be in a database online and searchable by the general public.
Yeah.
And I think we're entering an age where this level of transparency, it's much easier to do than it used to be because all of this data is electronic. And it seems to me that if there is a pushback on the part of people to get this done, we're also entering an age where people are rightly skeptical of efforts to conceal these things. What are your thoughts on this?
Absolutely. I think the age has advanced to the point where, let's back up just a minute.
Please.
In the software world, let's go back to the software world. In the software world,
okay,
for the last 30, almost 40 years now, maybe even longer, there's been a move towards having open source and that, software code, which means you put your code out there in the public.
Yep.
And that's created, it's not been measured as well as it should be, but it's created just, billions, trillions of dollars of wealth to the public of this code being out there. And then recently, in the last couple of decades, the academic world has started to adopt the same standard. So now, if you go to the American Economic Association, the standard is if you publish a paper, you've got to release your code and your data to say how you got to your answer. And that development, I think, in academia, in the software world, it's created so much wealth, and it's been so good for everyone that I think it's impossible to ignore when it comes to the government. And now you have all these people who are technically savvy, who understand data, who understand transparency, who are coming into government and saying, hey, why isn't this available to the public? We could make this available to the public, no problem. And so there's this massive opening up now, which I don't see any reason why it'll stop. One danger that comes with that is that some of the data in government it's not about government, it's about the people governed. And it's not just some of the data, it's a lot of the data. So there's data on taxpayers. You've got every taxpayer in the country is trusting government to keep their data safe.
Right.
Everyone who fills out a benefit form, everyone who has any interaction with government, who fills out a regulatory form, anyone who has interaction with government, which is all of us, all of our businesses, all of our nonprofits, all of our churches, all of our activities, we're all giving information all the time to government. And so as we're moving into this age of transparency, there has to be a very clear delineation between what are we doing to make what government is doing transparent without undermining the privacy of Americans. And I think a big success to achieve that will be if you make government smaller and it collects less data from the public, then that risk gets smaller.
Right.
So if government is just governing and not collecting everyone's business, then if you start to make government more transparency, all's good. But right now, government is so entwined in our lives that when you start to make government more transparency, you have to be really careful not to make everything else transparent too. The people's.
We've had the folks on, Heather Lauer from People United for Privacy have been on the show before. You pulled out the file from your files behind you. For those of you who are listening and not watching, Matthew's got a bunch of file boxes behind him. I've got a bookshelf behind me. I pulled this off of my shelf. It's a mug from People United for Privacy. Of course, it's backwards on the video feed. Transparency is for government. Privacy is for people. It's a very, very simple aphorism there, but it's one that's has the benefit of being true, as it were. So I get that there. Let's turn our attention to regulation. Not that we haven't been talking about it before, but this issue of 10 out, one in, 10 out. For every new regulation, we get rid of 10 others. I was admittedly skeptical of the 1 in, 2 out in the first Trump term. But that being said, what I also found very important is that Trump kept the cost of regulation to 1/3 of 1% per year. Again, unprecedented in the modern era of regulations. In the 55 years of the modern regulatory state, that is unprecedented to keep it that low. And I'd be happy if we kept it that low now. What do you think the feasibility of 10 out for every one that we create is? Is it easier, again, because of things like AI and open source code and all of those things? Obviously it's essential. We can talk about that, but what's the feasibility?
It's absolutely, we've had, as you said, 55 plus years of the modern regulatory state that has built up a body of regs and rules that are now ripe for the picking, ripe for the picking and putting in the trash can. And so it's absolutely feasible to cut 10 regulations. There's so many on the books, hundreds of thousands of pages that are available to be cut. And then one of the questions is, well, how do you cut wisely? How do you cut the stuff that is really holding back the most activity, that's constraining people in the most onerous ways? And AI, and not just AI, but basic text processing, which we've had for a while now, helps a great deal. So now we can go in, we can process those many, many thousands of pages of documents. We can find the most significant ones. We can even go back and we can trace the connection between the rules and then the authorizing statutes, and find the statutes that authorize the most rules, and you can trace this whole network of documents in government and find the ones to pluck out.
One of the things we're looking at is the issue of rules that were upheld under the old Chevron standard that had maybe a marginal interpretation of the underlying statute. And going back and unpeeling those, because we can always petition an agency to reopen a rulemaking to sort of go back to things. It's what we've done with the OMB and the aforementioned cost benefit analysis, the circular A4 from 2023, asking them to go and revert to the prior to 2023 standards or offer up a new proposal that corrects the deficiencies in the new standard. But, there are all kinds of ways to go down this road, aren't there, and do this?
Absolutely. There's the new Chevron doctrine, new update, removal. Yep. That's going to provide both opportunity in government, and it's also going to provide a opportunity for private sector actors to challenge existing regs. There's new technological ways of looking at the regulations. I think, as mentioned before, OMB has a new opportunity to start to measure the fiscal effects of regulations and make them easier to legislate away in reconciliation.
And also just making compliance easier. Again, you talk about open source code. We talk about this. It's 2025. There's no reason why a regulated entity, I call them Rs, average regulated entity. There's no reason why an average regulated entity can't go onto a website, a database somewhere, enter in some key pieces of information about the business, kind of business, the industrial classification code, the size of the business, the location, the number of employees, the location, and it should be able to spit out in plain English everything the business needs to do to comply. I mean, we know that for a business with 20 employees or less, regulatory costs are 50% higher because it's usually some poor civilian individual having to noodle through exactly what the standards are that they have to comply with. There's no reason why we can't go down this road and make it easier, is there?
That's right. And as a small business owner, it's absolutely a huge challenge. Comply with the regulations, the payroll regulations, business activity regulations. It becomes a huge challenge to running your business. And frankly, I think it's one of the reasons why we don't see more young people starting businesses. Right. Is that you're forcing the people in your society who are the innovators, who want to move fast, who want to make things, you're forcing them to do paperwork. And it's a bad mix. And so to the extent that we can either reduce, not either, to the extent that we can both reduce the paperwork burden by getting rid of the regulations and also reduce the paperwork burden by creating new tools, like you just mentioned, to make it easier to find which regulations you have to comply with and give you tips for how to comply with them most effectively. Anything we can do to reduce the paperwork burden for our most innovative, most paperwork averse individuals in society is going to be a huge win. A huge win.
So let's get back to something else, because I haven't even gotten to how you got interested in all this. I mean, my journey, I worked for a blind lawyer for many, many years, who was an environmental lawyer, but also a constitutional scholar, and sort of backed my way into the regulatory world, find it fascinating, this whole thing, the intersection of the regulatory state and the Constitution. How did you get involved in all this? Did you know you wanted to become an economist? I mean, how did it happen for you?
I did not. It's a little bit of a funny story. I spent a lot of time working with a hedge fund when I was in college.
Excellent.
And then, right after college, I was working with a hedge fund again. And it's a open floor plan. You've got an image of the trading floors where everyone's got the 6 monitors and everyone's got their monitors on this open room. And I was supposed to be reading those linear algebra papers for building models, building trading models. I was supposed to be reading those linear algebra models. And sometimes you get bored of work, right? Sometimes you get bored in the middle of the day. I couldn't go.
Were you a mathematics major in college? Were you a computer science major in college?
I was math in college. Yeah. So
imagine this: someone who does economics who's got an undergraduate degree in math. I mean, that's amazing.
Well, I'm not a trained economist. I should know. I've come into economics through work. And
okay. That's fine.
It's fine.
At least you're someone who's doing work on economics, who's got a background in math, as opposed to all of us who really need to rely on calculators in a big way. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It helps to be able to do the arithmetic quickly. my math major could.
Hold on, time out. Because we literally, when I say we have a rule because I do radio in addition to policy work that I do, and obviously the podcast, the rule is never do math on the air.
Right.
Because folks can smell the wood chips in your head burning through the airwaves as you're trying to noodle through what the numbers are. So yes, this is why we don't do this. Go ahead.
Back to the trading floor. All the monitors open. I got bored at work sometimes. You can't pull up Facebook and waste time when you're open trading on an open floor plan. And so what I did instead was I started pulling up other papers I found interesting. I came across this guy, Kevin Hassett's papers.
Sure.
Now he's the NEC director. Before he was the CEA chair. Before that, he was running the econ department at the American Enterprise Institute. Yeah. So I was sitting there. I'm supposed to be reading my linear algebra paper. Instead, I'm reading Kevin's economics papers. And I just said to myself, I want to go work for that guy. So I found a job opening at AEI, applied for it, went and interviewed with Kevin. That was one of the I still remember every moment of that first year interview.
Wow.
And started working as a research assistant, very bottom of they had one quantitative research assistant for the whole economics group that would float around, and then everyone had their personal economics research assistants. I was the floating guy. So I'd float around. I got to work with everyone. A lot of greats back then at AEI. And then a couple of years in, getting more and more involved in the legislative process, more and more involved in back then it was the Romney presidential campaign was happening. And a couple of things really set me off. And I said, we got to have open source modeling.
Sure.
And that got me in the open source modeling space. And that's what I've been doing for quite a while since then.
That is amazing. It's always nice to hear those stories. You get the opportunity, you read something, and you find out that folks are actually a lot more accessible than you might otherwise think. I will never forget, having a particular question about a small L libertarian philosophy, and reaching out to somebody at Cato and being remarkably impressed by the fact that they got back to me and they answered my question, which was amazing. And I try to return the favor, if I get, these kinds of inquiries about things. It's all, and it's so important to train the next generation. So I tell a lot of guests, so I do 3 podcasts now, and nobody should do 3 podcasts. We need to get you on the regulatory one that I do. But I was going to do a podcast called Outside Interests, which was focused on the folks who are doing, policy work or political work, because we all have outside interests. I do competitive barbecue, for instance, and I love music history and things like that. I love to cook. I got the idea because of a guy named Larry Spywak over at the Phoenix Center. He plays blues harmonica in a band. So when you're not doing this kind of work, I know you got at least one kid, maybe a couple. I don't know. You can tell me that, or you don't have to. But what are some of your outside interests when you're not doing this stuff? What are you doing?
I've got 3 boys.
Wow.
Couple months, 3 and 6. I spent a lot of time hanging out with them. That's the best thing.
Listen, when you go from 2 kids to 3 kids, you switch from the man-to-man defense to the zone defense.
It's a different world.
The whole dynamic changes, yeah.
Although my little guy can't crawl yet. I think when he starts moving, it's going to be even more important.
Yes. We all wait for that moment where they can move on their own, and then it's like, oh my God, why can't they just sit still now?
Go have babies, though, people.
Yes.
And I like music. I don't play in a band or anything, but when I'm have a minute to go and relax, I go and sit down at the piano and noodle my way to some relaxation.
Is there a relationship between having an aptitude for math and an aptitude for playing the piano? Because I don't have an aptitude for math, and I've always wanted to learn to play piano, and it's just never hit. But do you think there's a relationship between the two?
I think there might be. I think I've seen some studies that suggest there is, but I don't know if I trust those studies. But
there you go. Well, we have to find the models upon which they're based.
But I think based on personal observation, there's probably a little bit of a connection.
You playing classical? You playing singer-songwriter? What the American Songbook? What do you like to play?
A little bit of everything. I mostly sit down, like I said, and noodle. But a lot of my lists, it'll kind of be based on what I'm listening these days. So if I'm listening to classical music, it'll come out kind of sounding a little classical. If I'm listening to the jazz,
so you compose for yourself?
If you call it that, I just sit down and play.
Sure.
I sit down and make a beautiful sound as best I can.
Do you record this stuff at all? I mean, and transcribe it? I mean, that's the other great thing is now you can sort of noodle through on the piano and have something recording it and transcribe it onto sheet music. Do you do that?
I just got myself a MIDI controller, a little controller keyboard to plug into my computer. And so I've started to do a little bit of it, but mostly it's just for me and for my kids, my wife and my family. I try to make a nice, nice sound so that the family has something nice to listen to while they're hanging out in the house.
This is why I ask these questions, because I find it so I find it fascinating. B, of course, I get very envious of the folks who have these great skills that I don't have.
Well, you gotta listen.
I will recommend. What was that?
You've got to listen to it before you.
No, but still, let me tell you something. I'm a big fan. There was a jazz new age music label called Narada, which was very big in the 80s, late 80s and into the 90s. And there was a songwriter, pianist named Michael Jones. And I can let it. So again, some of it sounds like he's just noodling it through on the piano, but I cannot recommend it enough. I mean, when you're thinking about it, who are some of your favorite musicians, piano players, whether it's classical or rock or whatever, who are you listening to, or does it change all the time?
It's changing all the time, a lot based on the kids' interests these days. But you can't beat Bach. You can't beat Bach. You can't beat Armstrong. You can't. Even one of the things that I've learned as I played more is that there are just so many brilliant musicians out there.
Oh yeah,
and I think the farther away I get from being just truly awful at playing, I'm not going to say the better I get, but the farther away I get from being truly awful, the more I appreciate all of the brilliant musicians and just the musical genius that exists in so many humans. And I love it.
And it doesn't matter if you think you're not playing well. I know I have a terrible singing voice, but there are songs that I used to sing to my kids that they still love today. There are songs I used to play for my kids that they still love today and resonate well. And we'll go through a minor, one's in college, one's out of college, and there still is an impact there. So the fact that you're playing this stuff for your kids now is amazing. Well, Matthew, how do folks find out more about the good work you're doing at AFPI?
Well, if you go to ofra.org, it'll take you right to our site at AFPI, OFRA, just like okra, but Ofra with an F. Nice. Ofra.org, take you to AFPI site. You can check out our work there. And then there's also a lot of other just really terrific work being done at AFPI. So poke around on the rest of the website because there's a lot of really high quality content on there.
Well, my guest has been Matthew Jensen. He is the Director of Fiscal and Regulatory Analysis at AFPI Center for American Prosperity. This has been yet another episode of the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour podcast, or the Lunch Hour Federal Newswire. As I said at the top of the show, if you're watching us on our YouTube channel, you can take us with you on the many fine podcast platforms. Wherever you're getting your podcast content, you're going to find the audio files of the Lunch Hour. If you're listening to us on one of those podcast platforms, check us out on YouTube. Please subscribe, hit the like button, leave some comments, and most importantly, let your friends and family members and your family members' friends all know about the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.